The 20-second most popular TED Talk of all time might be based on a complete and utter lie. In today's show, best-selling author Bruce Daisley and I look into the hard evidence behind growth mindset to myth-bust whether it's fact or fiction. But first, here's another podcast I'd recommend. The Duct Tape Marketing Podcast is a wonderful marketing podcast, one of my favourite marketing podcasts, and I really recommend you listen to it. You'll hear tips, tactics about marketing, you'll get resources for small, medium business owners and, marketers anywhere, really. And one recent episode that I'd really recommend you listen to is the strategy behind building a thriving online community for your brand. You'll learn community building, how marketing can boost your community, and also how you can gain a lot out of that community as well. It's a must listen. So go and listen to Duct Tape Marketing, which is brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network. Do you have grit? According to best-selling author Angela Duckworth, grit is the tendency to sustain interest and effort towards very long-term goals. Some of us have it, some don't. People are born with various levels of grit, according to Duckworth. But the good news is you can build grit if you adopt a certain mindset. A growth mindset, popularized by Carol Dweck. And if you get yourself some resilience training, well, grit and growth mindset will come easily to you. Now, you may or may not have grit, but you've probably heard of it. Angela's TED Talk on the subject is legendary.
That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
That's the end of Angela's famous TED Talk, the 22nd most popular TED Talk of all time. It's quite the feat. It has 27 million viewers on TED.com and 10 million viewers on YouTube, and her work has been shared in hundreds of books, thousands of courses, and in millions of organizations worldwide. But is any of it true? Is there evidence to back it up, or is it pure business jargon? That's what I asked today's guest, Bruce Daisley. Bruce is a best-selling author with his book, Joy of Work. He has become regarded as a thought leader in subjects like workplace culture and the future of work. And in his latest book, Fortitude, he looks into grit and growth mindset and resilience training and investigates the evidence. Is it brilliant or is it bull? Here's Bruce.
Yeah, in the book, I do go into something of like an investigation mode, largely because, there's one chapter which sort of tries to get to the bottom of the challenge that I think someone posed for me. So someone said to me, two people actually said to me within a very short period of time, when I told them, it's always sort of mildly demoralizing when you tell someone you're writing a book on resilience and they roll their eyes and you're like, right, okay, okay. Can I ask why you rolled your eyes? And the first woman said, oh my God, we've all been sent on resilience training at work and, everyone is reluctant to admit it, but it doesn't work and it doesn't have any impact. Okay, then someone else I know who works in an NHS hospital, she said to me, if you mention resilience around here, you get thumped in the face. And so it's because largely resilience is kind of the way that toxic regimes, toxic environments attempt to justify themselves. They say, it's strange that you're feeling burnt out because not everyone here is burnt out. Maybe you need some resilience training. And it's a brilliant reframe. This idea that we're working 3 hours a day more than we did 15 years ago, and that you're in back-to-back video calls, or you're constantly beset with someone pinging you for something, and you don't have room to breathe, and you sort of open your calendar on a Monday morning and you feel this breathless claustrophobia that, oh my gosh, how am I going to get my work done? And you feel overwhelmed. And then someone strides in and says, you're not very resilient, are you? Like the idea that it's on you, and there's some history of that. Probably the spirit that lives throughout the book is a professor called Alex Haslam, who's just like this wonderful, inspirational researcher who's a social scientist, and he said to me, look, there's a long history of this. He said back in the 2000s, the early 2000s, there was a hospital, the West Dorset NHS Trust, and they, for the first time, they received a warning from the Public Health England, I think, saying you've got a toxic environment here, you need to make amends, you need to make this a less stressful place of work, and for fear of penalty. And their response to that was to say, okay, we're going to send everyone on resilience training. So not deal with the fact that they had this toxic regime, but we need to toughen everyone up. Now, there's a lot of parallels in the conversations we're hearing at work right now. Bosses saying, we've got a burnout epidemic. Oh, well, in my day, that never happened. So we need to toughen everyone up. So it became this sort of investigation, firstly, into this training that is offered to people. And there's something of a resilience orthodoxy that at the heart of all of this training is, I guess, a single idea, which is that an individual is responsible for the outcomes of these situations. Because that's what resilience training is. Resilience training is saying, this is on you. And so let me teach you the ways of doing it. And so that's had an enormous span of influence. In the US, the lead researcher is a guy I like to see as like the Robert De Niro of psychology, in the sense that no one can doubt this dude has a formidable body of work. But Martin Seligman, his later work isn't as good as his earlier work. I think it's the way I would describe it. And yet, so Martin Seligman is pretty much any time you find someone going on a resilience course, or he had a hand in grit. He co-wrote the original paper of Grit, Angela Duckworth's work, or his influence really strides into growth mindset. All of these things, growth mindset is adjacent, because growth mindset says the reason why you're not improving is nothing to do with poor education or the trauma that you experience as an individual, or the inputs that have led you to here. None of that. It's about whether you believe. It's what you bring to it. It's the application you bring to this moment.
I'm just going to pause here to briefly explain some of the concepts Bruce is sharing. You might not have heard of them, but you've probably seen them somewhere, whether that's in training or courses or elsewhere. So let's start with growth mindset. A growth mindset refers to an individual's belief about their talent. The opposite of a growth mindset is a fixed mindset. That's a belief that your talents are due to inborn traits. For example, someone might believe that they got a pay rise because they are naturally smart and naturally talented. In contrast, a growth mindset refers to the belief that talents are malleable by whatever means. So, for example, someone might believe that they got a pay rise because they worked really hard or because they sought out extra help. Grit is similar but slightly different. Grit refers to someone's ability to persist after setbacks. Grit is related to growth mindset because if one believes that failures are due to their own fixed traits, there's no reason to keep trying. But if you have a growth mindset, you'll get grit because you think, I can keep trying to get better. And resilience training, well, that's what you take to adopt both a growth mindset and to get more grit. All right. Lots of theory there. Hopefully you're still following along, and hopefully you're still wondering if any of this stuff is worth its salt, because according to Bruce, it's everywhere.
Growth mindset is everywhere. It's like Japanese knotweed. It's you can't escape it. I started looking at the websites of schools from local primary schools, local comprehensive schools, local private nursery schools, local Eton. They've all got growth mindset on the website. It's in the national curriculum of Northern Ireland. Organisations like Google say we hire for growth mindset. It's everywhere. And yet, if you look into the research of growth mindset, the original research, one person, when the conundrum that was facing a lot of organisations, a lot of researchers, which was no one could replicate Angela Duckworth's work. Carol Dweck's work. No one could replicate Carol Dweck's work. So people were trying to work out why on earth are her results so remarkable? Because the essence of growth mindset, in essence, is that it changes 3 or 4 words and it has a transformational effect. The first growth mindset research teaches a group of kids who were set a series of challenges. It teaches them, after they fail in the second part of the challenge, it teaches them a lesson, which is, I believe I'm someone who I can improve. My effort will make me get better, from the opposite of that. I forget the word, so sorry. But effectively, the results are transformational, and people went back and tried to reproduce it, and they couldn't get close. And someone said, which I think was a really sort of sharp observation, they said they discovered that there was one thing that all of the replications of growth mindset had in common, that all of the failed replications didn't. And it was the presence of Carol Dweck. Every time Carol Dweck did the work, the results seemed to work. Every time she wasn't present, now her response to that was, people aren't following my methodology appropriately. And that begs a really important question, because if a school's got to very exactly implement her methodology, I don't think that understands the chaos of the classroom. I don't think that understands, the idea that you could do it. Anyway, latterly they have set about trying to do some new adaptations of growth mindset. And there does appear to be a very small impact on children who otherwise would have failed school. So it's a small impact. It's about it's about 1 grade point. Actually, maybe that's a big impact. It's about 1 grade point for people who are going to fail school. But for the majority of the people, it's a bit of a fairy tale about individualism, really. If you want to see a correlation with school results, the biggest correlation with school results is household income. So, so getting people out of poverty would be way more effective than teach them growth mindset. But broadly, what you find through all of these things, so like there's a chapter of the book which is like a detective novel style investigation of trying to get to the bottom of why all of these stories about resilience are propagated at people and why so few of them seem to have any result.
So let's get into the evidence. Does grit exist? Shortly after Duckworth's book first appeared, Marcus Creed, the researcher at Iowa State University, published a rigorous analysis of all of the data used in the book. He didn't do half measures, he looked at 90 studies on grit. As Bruce shares in his book, the conclusion was that when it came to raw numbers, the grit effect either appeared to be massively overstated or insufficient attention was paid to the specifics of how the results were expressed. For example, Duckworth claimed that among cadets at the West Point Military Training Center, those who scored highly for grit were 98% more likely to complete summer training. The problem with that figure, as Creed points out, is that it neglects to take into account the fact that the overall completion rate is 94%. Now, while it's impressive that 98% of the grittiest candidates made it through, and a 4-point lift in success is certainly not negligible, it is somewhat misleading to present the results that way. What looks like a guaranteed ticket to military greatness now just looks like a minor jump. And what about resilience training? Well, there are studies on that too. An analysis conducted by 6 senior military leaders and published in Military Psychology in 2013 looked at resilience training offered for US cadets. They found that when they made resilience training voluntary, no one signed up to attend. Military personnel themselves just did not believe it would help them. In the same report, a study of personnel currently serving in Afghanistan who had undertaken resilience training concluded, despite the training, both resilience thinking and morale were observed to decline across the period of the training. So grit and resilience training both seem like fairly weak principles when put under scrutiny. And in his book, Bruce shares the same is true for growth mindset. Timothy Bates at the University of Edinburgh tried multiple times to reproduce Carol Dweck's growth mindset results with 12-year-olds. They found that growth mindset training had no significant effect on cognitive performance. Children's own mindsets, they went on, showed no relation to IQ, school grades, or changes in school grades across the school year. Their conclusion was that there was little or no support for the idea that growth mindsets are beneficial for children's responses to failure or school attainment. Bates ran another study in China with 200 12-year-olds and found the same thing. Meanwhile, the 2018 study with a vast sample size of 365,000 participants found that the overall correlation between growth mindset and academic achievement is weak. This is completely counter to Carol Dweck's research. Dweck claimed that 67% of children who were praised for effort would pick more challenging problems, whereas only 8% of those praised for intelligence picked challenging problems. The thing is, no study can replicate this. Despite it being omnipresent in schools and offices and self-help books across the world, the evidence for these principles is slim. So why? Why did all the researchers get it wrong? Why do millions of people across the world follow these principles? Well, it might be because we didn't really know what resilience is. See, popular belief states that resilience is a trait. It's something you either have or you don't. And it's also like a muscle. Some people are naturally more resilient, but others build the muscle through training. That's how we view resilience. You can build more resilience by practicing. But that might not be true. Resilience might not be a trait. Instead, it could be a state that you embody if the circumstances are right. For example, you might be more resilient when you've got savings in your bank, or a loving family, or no significant health problems, or perhaps parents that read to you at night. If that's true, then that changes the whole ballgame. Resilience isn't the thing we need to work on, it's everything else. Our standard of living, health, wealth could be key, not our mindset. After this quick break, I asked Bruce what he thought. Is resilience a trait or just a state of mind? Now, most marketers listening to this podcast will have that awful experience of using a tool or a piece of software and starting to scale that tool or piece of software as your business scales or as your needs scale, and find that you start to hit limits, things that you can't go above, things that you can't change, which means, well, you just can't accomplish the activity you need to do. This is a real problem with marketing software, but it is not a problem with the HubSpot CRM platform. HubSpot is an all-in-one CRM platform that is impossible to outgrow, and it's ridiculously easy to use, meaning you don't ever have to worry about it slowing you down. That's because HubSpot is purpose-built for businesses that test and learn and pivot and push and do it all over again next quarter. With customizable hubs and tools that you can use to add or subtract as you grow, HubSpot is ready to help scale with your business, with your customers, and the moments that matter the most. Learn how HubSpot can help your business grow better at HubSpot.com. Okay, back to the show. Here's Bruce answering if resilience is a trait or just a state of mind.
The idea that whether resilience is a trait or a state is a really big, is sort of, it might seem like a nuance, but it's a really critical thing because quite often, I think we're led to believe that resilience is this trait. There's some people, when we watch the news, we look at some people who've done these remarkable things and think, oh my goodness, they've got access to this bravery that I feel feeble and embarrassing in comparison. It gives us a really clear pointer, actually, of where resilience lives, and we'll come on to that in a sec. But, I think there's a recognition from people who study it that resilience is a state. And once you recognise that some people aren't gifted with being more resilient, once you recognise that, this isn't something that some people have got that others haven't got, it's a sort of state of mind. It makes you reflect on it in a slightly different way. There aren't these superhuman people. There doesn't seem to be something that we can do tests to identify whether there's some background that's got people to a place of resilience. I think, demystifying it is really helpful.
And researchers at the University of Queensland and at Harvard University seem to agree. As Bruce shares in his book, their work suggests that resilience isn't some kind of natural trait, and it's certainly not regarded as a permanent mental state. Instead, it is a state that anyone can embody if the circumstances are right. Nobody talked about the resilience of the Ukrainian people prior to the war with Russia, but these people showed resilience when the circumstances required it. They didn't need training, they just needed the circumstances to be right. And saying otherwise, claiming that some people aren't showing resilience, is in fact harmful. It's really victim blaming.
To some extent, resilience, the way we talk about resilience, is victim blaming because, broadly what you find is people are normally given the invocation to be resilient when something's gone wrong to them. And if they can't exhibit resilience, then we go, okay, well, it's a shame we weren't a bit more resilient. And yet that, to a large extent, is saying to people who've, by the nature of that exercise, have just experienced misfortune, saying to them, well, it's a shame you're not able to get back on your feet because other people are. And maybe those other people didn't have the same misfortune. So, I look at it when you see resilience in the news, resilience. The people of Flint, Michigan, you occasionally see this sort of venture into your timeline where the people of Flint, Michigan had polluted water, tap water, for best part of a decade. And, they were told they just needed to be a bit more resilient. And what you're basically hearing there is someone saying, yeah, just go away and deal with it. Yeah, stop bothering us. Why do you just keep moaning about this? Why can't you deal with it? And effectively, it's like this lack of empathy. It's like transferring the responsibility of dealing with it onto people who are suffering misfortune.
So you might be listening to this and think, well, resilience is a load of old rubbish. It's not important. But that's not true. The debate here is about how you build resilience, and clearly there's a lot of misinformation about that. But those that do find themselves in a state of resilience, they will benefit, because resilience, or fortitude as Bruce calls it, can be really powerful. In fact, it can save lives. Here's Bruce with an eye-opening study to explain.
This research took a series of, I think it was women who just received a cancer diagnosis, and it then interpreted their explanatory style. So it categorized whether they were stoical about it, whether they were combative, like they were like, I'm going to fight this. There's no way this is going to beat me. Whether they catastrophized it, or whether they were defeated about it.
I should add here that the research was weighted based on the type of cancer. Obviously, you might feel defeated with a terminal cancer versus a beatable cancer, but that was factored into the research. The women all had comparable forms of cancer, and the only difference, according to the research, was the 4 categories of how the women viewed their cancer.
I think they revisited those people 5 years on, and the tragedy of it is that explanatory style did appear to have a relationship with the outcomes. So the women who'd catastrophized or been defeated were far less likely to be alive, were far less likely to have had good life outcomes. And the women who'd had this fiery, never say die, I'm going to beat this, like this almost sort of performatively, robust response were far more likely to have survived and to have fought off the cancer. Now, look, it makes me really uncomfortable to say all of that, because it feels like it's saying that it's down to some individual, and to some extent, it's slightly contradictory with what I've been saying before. It's that these things are to some extent in the way that we respond ourselves. But I think it's an illustration of the impact that personal control has on us, the impact on sort of us believing that we can have an impact on those things. One thing you observe in teenagers now is that they do appear to be more likely to say that the outcomes of situations are far more likely to be fate. That was destined to happen. It was out of my control. And to some extent, that represents an absence of a locus of control. And these patients who said, I'm going to fight this and beat it off, is a locus of control. We believe that we've got some impact on this. And having that locus of control does appear to have some degree of impact on outcome.
Control is important. It's one of the factors we need to build a state of resilience. For example, if you're stressed out at work, getting burnt out, but you have control over your actions, say a bunch of savings that mean you can quit comfortably, or you're self-employed so you can reduce the workload without much bother, then you'll show more resilience. Whereas someone without control, say a junior doctor in the NHS with no choice but to work the hours they're given, or risk losing 7 years of hard training, that someone without control is far less likely to find a state of resilience. This isn't a theory, there's some hard evidence to back it up.
There's another piece of work done by Martin Seligman. So having discounted some of his later work. This is some of his earlier work where it was one of his last animal experiments, I think, but he injected cancerous tumours into rats. And these cancerous tumours were regarded as having a 50% lethality rate. If half of the rats who would have this cancerous tumour injected into them would die. And then he put them into a manipulated environment, which was a cage that had, I think, 15 electric shocks during the course of the day, every day. But the rats, in half of the cases, had a little touchpad that they could touch to stop the electric shock. And the rats who had the control, who were able to change their environment, were significantly less likely to die than the rats who couldn't. The rats who couldn't control their environment, who, were rendered into this state of helplessness, what fresh hell is coming along now? I think 3/4 of those rats died. And the rats who were able to control their environment and appear to have some degree of impact on their experience, I think about a quarter of them died. So it was 3/4 who couldn't, a quarter who could, and it demonstrates to some extent it's sometimes this illusion of control, or this sense that we can control our environment, does seem to have a big impact on life outcomes, really.
Having an element of control in a situation will increase your resilience during that situation. And it's not just resilience, by the way, it's stress as well. In one experiment, rats were deprived of a sense of control via an injection of Botox that froze their muscles and limited their mobility. A measure of control, however, was returned to some of them in the forms of pieces of wood on which they could chew. The researchers found that the stress levels of those rats able to exert just some control over their lives through chewing did not go above the previous baseline level of stress. Among the rats denied that ability of control, the ability to chew, for them the stress levels rose to 7 times their previous level. Chewing, in this scenario, can help reduce stress because it gave them that feeling of control. It makes you think that chewing gum manufacturers are missing a trick. Some of us need gum because it makes our breath smells nicer, but far more of us need to reduce stress. So perhaps it should be remarketed from Wrigley's Extra Fresh to Wrigley's Quick De-Stress. All right, let's round up one key point from today. Resilience isn't something that you get from some course or something you learn while studying at Eton or Yale. It's something you experience when the conditions are right. One of those conditions is control. So next time you hear someone bemoaning their work or lamenting their partner, ask yourself, what level of control do they have? Rather than telling them to harden up or show a bit of resilience, have a think about how they could go about getting more control. After all, that's an actual proven way to build resilience. Okay, folks, that is all for today. If you're looking for something else to listen to, go and check out episode 22 of Nudge. It is a 2-year-old episode, but it is with today's guest, Bruce Daisley, and on it, we discuss how to be a good boss. 75% of Americans hate their boss, and on the show, Bruce explains why this is and how to be one of the few bosses that people actually like. I've left a link to that episode in the show notes. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to buy Bruce's book, Fortitude. This book is a treasure trove of insight. When I'm reading books for the show, I use an app on my phone to take notes. And Bruce's book has the honour of being the book with the most notes. Why? Because there is just so much good stuff in there. If you care about the subjects we've spoken about today, then you'll love that book. So go and pick up a copy. And if you like the show, please consider doing the 3 other things I always ask you to do, which is subscribe to the show wherever you listen, sign up to my newsletter, and give the show a review. Do all 3 and you will genuinely make my day, so thank you. All right, that is all. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nudge. I'm your host, Phil Agnew, and I'll be back in another week for another episode.